how to pick the best and the people, like you said, to be part of the middle tier, and not to continue as their headmasters and stuff. Because sometimes you can't do both. No?
Yeah. I can just kind of speculate, really. I've not studied how they were selected in these different systems. Sometimes when there was data available, it would be successful schools. So if you have some test data, for example, so in Shanghai, for example, the model is that if there's a school that has turned itself around, so used to be a failing school and now is actually a very good school, and that's demonstrated either by results or, everyone can see that now this is a very popular school, the children are doing well, then that person will be asked to support other schools, not necessarily leave being a head teacher. It's quite a nice model in Shanghai where they might, the district might organise for a very successful head teacher to just spend a bit of time in a different school to support the leadership there and basically train them up and then go back to their original school.
I mean, the question was how to motivate those people and maybe how to persuade them.
Oh, I see.
To work for that.
I see.
Because that will be the challenge, I think, for our education system.
Yeah, I think it depends on how you organise the role. If those people can see that they can have even more of an educational impact by essentially leading their peers, supporting their peers, supporting other head teachers, and they're paid decently as well. Pay motivates, doesn't it? It's not the only motivator, but pay does motivate. So if they're paid a good wage and they can see that there's a potential to have a positive impact, then I think that would be persuasive.
I hope someone from Ministry of Education is listening.
Yeah, Ministry, please pay all of your education once more.
We got first question in chat. I'll just read it. It's from Michal Hudeček. In your talk, you assumed teachers are trying to explain things to kids. However, in the Czech Republic, there are still many teachers who follow discovery learning approach called Hejného method in math. They believe that they should not explain things and that the kids should discover everything by themselves. What does your research say about it?
So, not my research personally, but the research that I'm familiar with says that that's not a very good idea, because my kind of research, most of the research evidence that I speak about comes from two main sources. One is international comparisons, and well, in this instance, studies of pedagogy and effectiveness of pedagogy in general, and the other is cognitive psychology. My background is psychology, and from both positions, both suggest that pure discovery learning, when it's a case of teacher doesn't explain things and the children discover it for themselves, is not very effective in terms of children understanding what it is they're supposed to understand. So we know that just by looking at the data. So for example, from PISA, the data from PISA speaks very, very clearly about this. And in fact, I've included this in the presentation that I might speak to everyone about right in this session. But in brief, the PISA data suggests that discovery learning doesn't lead to children understanding things. And there's a cognitive science reason for that as well, which is that in terms of how children's memory works, the simple model of memory, so Daniel Willingham's kind of taken two existing models of memory and combined them in a way that's accessible for teachers. But is that children have a working memory and a long-term memory. Long-term memory is you can store potentially infinite amount, but people's working memory is quite limited. So if I ask you to remember a telephone number, you might just about be able to remember the telephone number. But if I then said 20 digits, you wouldn't be able to remember it because we have a limited space in our working memory. And so children are only able to learn things and retain that, understand things and remember it if we're quite careful about not overloading their working memory. And often in approaches like discovery learning, where the teacher hasn't explained it and the children are discovering things in the environment. There's too much information from too many different places, often that's actually irrelevant to the task. And that means it's quite difficult for children to actually understand what they're supposed to understand. Or if they do, it takes them a much longer time to understand it.
It's quite interesting. I'm not educated in Hegel method, so I can't argument like backward. But I read an interview with you where you said that in the lessons where the kids are discovering and having fun and stuff, I don't know how the translation was good or bad, that they are learning less, and you connect it with data now. It's pretty nice. So thank you for the first question, and maybe it will be some next. We'll appreciate it. Also, you mentioned that you have a presentation.
Yes,
another,
I do.
Maybe we can look at.
Yeah.
Talk about.
You want to show it? Is that okay?
And I'll just repeat the instructions for the others. Pro nově příchozí, protože jsem se k nám ještě připojili někteří další, tak zopakuji, že je možné pokládat otázky. Můžete je pokládat do chatu, v češtině, v angličtině. Já se pokusím to při svých schopnostech přeložit. Zároveň můžete i zvednout ruku a myslím zvednout ruku a přihlásit se a my vám udělíme slovo. And we're screen sharing.
Great. Thank you. So is everyone able to see
the whole?
We get everyone able to see that?
If you can see it, please
I don't need
use reactions via Zoom. You can like give us a finger or a smile or maybe a heart. So if you can see the presentation, yes, thank you. We got some.
Great, great. Lovely.
Great.
So if I do this, they can still see me, I think. Ooh, if I do this, so there we are. Right. I know you all know what visa is, but I just wanted to share one particular thing about it that sometimes people miss. So you all know that it's the Programme for International Student Assessments. It's designed to measure children's performance at the end of compulsory schooling, so roughly age 15 to 16. Sometimes people miss this though, that it tests the application of skills and knowledge in reading, maths and science. So it's not straightforwardly testing, can they solve this equation or, what is covalent bonding, to use that example again. It's giving them real life problems in as much as it can be real life when it's a test, but the kind of problem that they would, potentially come across in their work, in their lives. And they have to use their knowledge in reading, maths and science to solve it. So it is useful, and it does measure something useful. It's not just measuring, can they perform well in tests? It's measuring, can they use what they know? Therefore, you can't do well in these tests just through rote learning. And the reason I want to emphasize that is that sometimes people see that countries like Japan, Singapore, Shanghai perform highly, and they think, oh, well, that's just because they just memorize without understanding, and then they regurgitate the textbook on the test. And that doesn't explain why they do well in PISA, because PISA is measuring, can they use what they know? And you can only do that if you have properly understood it. So I also wanted to share with you a bit of data, because these systems have more in common than you might think. So when I first went out on my travels, I had certain stereotypes in mind, as I think everyone does. Partly those stereotypes are driven by the media, because a journalist will go to Finland or a journalist will go to Japan, and no offense to journalists, they do fantastic job. But if you're not necessarily an education specialist, you don't always see the educationally relevant things. You see what's on the surface. So if you go into Finland, you will see all the children are wearing their own clothes. They call the teacher by their first name. There are lots of beanbags around in the corridors with the children like sitting on the floor. Whereas if you go into Japan, they're wearing neat uniforms. There's a blackboard at the front of the room. They bow to the teacher when they come in. So they look very different in terms of one looks very, very formal, very traditional, and one looks very modern and very progressive. But what was surprising was that the actual pedagogy was more similar than you might think. I've just given away, I'm going to ask you all a question, even though I've just given away some of the answer, which is silly of me. Shouldn't have told you the answer first. That's not moving. There we are. So, so the way that the OECD have tried to measure pedagogy is using the student questionnaires in PISA. So the students all sit tests, obviously, for PISA. They also have a questionnaire where they were given lots of statements about what their teacher or what they might do in class, and they were told, this is from 2012, so maths was the main subject. So they were asked to think about the last maths lesson they had, that teacher, and then to say to what extent they agreed or disagreed with these statements. So I just give everyone a minute just to read through those statements. They weren't presented to the students like this in 2 different boxes, but this is how they categorized the answers later on in their analysis. So just have a read, everyone, through those statements, and then say, what do you think students in Finland and Japan were reporting more of?
And please write it to the chat.
Not yet. I will. I'll get them. I'm going to make it more numerical in a minute, so then I'll get people to give a number.
So please don't write it.
Okay, hopefully you've had time to read through those statements. Now, what the OECD then did is calculated a ratio of one index to the other. So basically a ratio of how much students agreed with this index of student-oriented instruction with how much they agreed with the index of teacher-directed instruction. I've used their data. This is my graph, but this is the OECD's data. So on the x-axis is this ratio that I spoke about. So towards the left, you've got relatively more student-oriented, where 1 is the students are reporting about the same amount of both of those approaches, and 3 is the students are 3 times more likely to agree with teacher-directed statements. So what I want from you all is a number. So thinking back on those statements, where on the graph, in terms of that x-axis, would you expect to see Finland? And where on that graph would you expect to see Japan? So have a think, first of all, and then in a minute, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat a number that you think is the place where you would see Finland. Okay, so feel free to start putting your number for Finland. Where is Finland on this graph?
You got the first 2 responses, both are 2.
Mm-hmm. Just have a guess. Don't worry about not knowing. Just based on your instincts, what do you think? I've got 1, a 2, a 2, a smiley face, and a 4.5. I don't know how to do averages, including smiley faces. Okay, I guess we'll just carry on then. So 2 and a bit, I would say, on average. Can you now put in the number that you think would be where Japan would be on this axis? Thank you, Jana.
It's like in the class, like the who are responding are still the same.
We have a 4, a 2.5, and a 4.5. Okay, thank you. So I do this question with a lot of people from a lot of different countries. And in general, people think that Finland is more student-oriented and more on the left of that graph. And they think that Japan is more teacher-directed, so more to the right of that graph, which, broadly speaking, we've got quite a small sample here, but broadly speaking, follows the same pattern. So the only difference, cultural difference, everyone thinks similar. The only cultural difference is Sweden. The Swedes are the only people who know what the Finns are actually doing. Mm-hmm. I think because they're neighbours. So this is where they actually are. Oops. Right, so I haven't got a little pointer, but if you have a look at the 3 down the bottom and then track right up from the 3, you will see that Japan and Finland are both in the same place on that x-axis. They are both around 3, just a little bit above 3. Singapore is in that same place. Canada is the same place. Czech Republic is the same place. And yeah, so there's a bit of a collection there. So they're taking a similar approach, Japan and Finland, to each other, despite the fact that they're very, very culturally different. You'll also notice that there is a correlation between being more teacher-directed, relatively speaking, and mathematics score. You find the same correlation in the science, when they did the same thing with science 3 years later. And what's carrying that relationship? So it's not because places that have lots of teacher direction do better. The reason there's a relationship here is because places that have lots of student-oriented instruction do worse. That's what's driving this relationship. To how teacher-directed a country is doesn't have make much of a difference on how students perform. But if they do lots of student-oriented instruction, they do worse. And that is true in every country that takes part in PISA, except Albania. I don't know what's happening in Albania. Albania is totally different to all the other countries. They don't do better, but it's just neutral. Whereas everything else, negative relationship between student-oriented instruction and performance. And I find that really interesting because a lot of people you might well think that pedagogy is a very culturally specific thing, and that what works in one place from a pedagogy perspective won't work in another because cultures are different. But what this data shows us is that some things don't work anywhere.
That means the student-oriented learning.
Yeah, so student-oriented learning, if you do too much of it, if that is your main way of teaching, and most of the time you are having the lesson is made up of students working independently or in groups, and you as a teacher are just walking around the different groups and checking how they're doing, that does not lead to much learning. That's what this data tells us. What it does look like, though, is it's not a case of a teacher standing at the front of the room and just talking either. That's also bad. There is a balance to be had, but what this looks like in practice, in terms of these countries that are between 3 and 3.5 on that graph, is if you have, let's take a 40-minute or a 50-minute lesson, it tends to be divided up into 3 or 4 chunks of 10 to 15 minutes. Some of that is the teacher explaining, is the teacher lecturing, but usually with lots of questions to the class, questions from the class. Some of that might be a whole class discussion where the teacher is hearing what students are saying and then saying, right, well, Daniel, what do you think of what Petra said? Some of it is students working independently. Some of it is students working in groups. But after each of those small chunks of the lesson, the teacher then brings everyone's attention back to the front and says, okay, what did we learn from that? What did you think? What did you think? And then makes an assessment of, are the class ready to move on to the next thing, or do I need to stress a point a bit more? And then they move on. So it's teacher directed in the respect that the teacher is very much in control of the activity in the classroom. It's quite varied. It's not just one thing, either the teacher talking all the time or the students working independently all the time. And that's what it looks like. Just one more thing on this, and then I'll open to questions again. One very reasonable response to this data would be to say, okay, well, that's fair enough if all you care about is students' mathematics score, but what about competencies like collaboration, creative problem solving, etc.? The OECD care very much about these things too. You know, the OECD love competency-based curricula. And so they have measured in each of the PISA cycles, in the past 3 PISA cycles, they have measured different competencies. So in this particular data set, they also measured creative problem solving. And it's not the case that the countries to the left of this graph do better in creative problem solving. So more student-oriented instruction does not mean students are better at problem solving. It doesn't also mean that they're better at collaborative problem solving. So I've just put on this graph here countries that do well in both. So countries that do well in both creative problem solving and mathematics, and then orange dots. And you can see that they're in a similar place on that graph. There's 11 of them, and 8 of them are all in like pretty much one place on that x-axis in terms of the balance of those 2 approaches. So these countries do give students freedom to pursue their own interests and do group work, but it tends to be at the end of a module, once the students have already understood the knowledge and the skills, and then it's giving them the time and the opportunity to then apply that learning through a project, working with their friends. So it's a way of applying what they've learned rather than a way of learning the stuff in the first place. So that chronology matters, the order in which those different types of teaching happen matters.
So if I want to summarize it for myself, the ideal lesson would be like in the first time to present something, to try to learn kids the new thing, then to put that something like collaborative work or something like that, and to make a reflection at the end.
Yeah, so? Something like that. Yeah, with the different activities.
That says it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we are at the end of your presentation.
Yes.
Once again, if you want to ask Lucy questions, you can either in chat or via Zoom by raising your hand here. I remember when reading Cleverlands, it was really interesting for me that the core was the PISA testing. But also you mentioned the limitations of PISA, and if you can, because now and in your speech, it was like we know it because of PISA and stuff. But what are the limitations of PISA testing as you see it?
I think the limitations are mainly to do with how PISA is used, rather than to do with the actual test itself. I think the actual tests are pretty good. As far as, I'm not an assessment expert, but I think the people who design PISA are. So, they have the best people working on how do we assess children's application of this important knowledge and skills. I think the problem with PISA is how politicians use it. And how, not just politicians, other people, including consultants like me. It's probably given too much importance because it's not the only international data set, but it's the most popular, I think, because it's not straightforwardly measuring can the child solve this equation. It is looking at how they use that knowledge. It's considered to be more relevant to real life application. And we must remember that it's not everything. that it doesn't measure everything. They do try. They do try and measure everything. And it is remarkable, actually, in terms of a data set, because they have these questionnaires and they try and measure the competencies too. But it's not all subjects. It's just one measure. You know, there are lots of things which you can't answer with data that you have to see for yourself or talk to people and understand how people feel about a system. Yeah.
I mean, when I was in Finland in 2019, in Czech Republic in this year, in this particular year, it was like a boom of let's make education like in Finland and stuff. And we see it from the perspective of they are good in PISA. And they were like, oh, but this wasn't the reason why we're doing the reforms. And we don't care much about PISA. Like we want to make happy citizens and stuff.
I don't think being better in PISA is a good reason by itself to do anything. But as I explained in my talk before, I think that often doing the right thing, in my opinion, this is a values-based question, but for me, equity is important in education. And thankfully, in a way, the things that make a country good at PISA are not at odds with an equitable approach to education. So I suppose what I tried to show in my book really is that it was to pull out the things which do make countries successful that don't also make students unhappy or make the system less equitable. So Singapore is very good at some things, but it's very stressful for children and it's quite unequal. Similarly in Shanghai, even though they do some great stuff in terms of like teacher training, career development and that kind of thing.
I read that in one interview you mentioned something about Czech curriculum and stuff, and it will be interesting for us maybe to see the Czech curriculum and Czech education system from your perspective. And I know that you're not expert in Czech education either. I'm a teacher, but it's I think interesting to have someone's point of view.
So I've just had a brief look at it. I spent a lot of time on Google Translate, putting sections of the curriculum, the basic curriculum into Google Translate. And then later someone sent me an English version. So I needn't have spent such a long time on Google Translate. But I had to look. And it seems to me that, broadly, I'm just going to go straight for what I think needs to change. But broadly speaking, it's, there's a lot of good stuff in there in terms of identifying important concepts that children need to understand and at different ages, breaking that down at different ages. It looks to me like there's quite different room for improvement in stage 1 versus stage 2. How the curriculum's laid out in stage 1, so up to end of 5th grade, stage 1?
End of 5th grade.
End of 5th grade. It seems to me to be quite vague. So especially some of the content, it will say things like classification of substances. And that's it, not right. What is it that children need to understand about classification of substances? So this is just one example. So the content is just listed just like the list of content rather than knowledge or understanding. So I think it would be better if it were listed as, right, these are the kind of most important understandings that we want children to have about these concepts, because it's the trouble with it being as vague as it is in terms of not specifying what actually it is that children need to know and understand with that, is that if different teachers interpret that in different ways, then you end up having, inequality for a start in terms of different primary schools, different schools will do it differently. And then also potentially a lack of coherence, because when children do move up to stage 2, they won't necessarily have the foundations they need to support them with that more difficult learning if the teacher interpreted that in a different way. Whereas stage 2 looks like, and it's not, I haven't looked at every subject, but I was interested particularly in history and science.
Well, both are my subjects.
Oh, good. There we go. They're really useful ones from a curriculum perspective because they work in different ways.
Yes.
It looks to me like there's lots of content in it, more than I think. I don't know, obviously, having been a teacher in Czech Republic, maybe you can tell me whether you think this is the case, but it seems to me like there's too much for all students to be able to do all of that and actually understand it properly and deeply. I think if I was teaching that, I would feel like I was rushing through it somewhat. So there's lots of it. It seems quite hard as well. So like lots of content, quite difficult, and a big jump between what's expected at stage 1 and what's expected at stage 2. It looks to me, but you are more of an expert.
That's very interesting because, well, I don't call myself an expert, but I'm a teacher of biology and history. And from my point of view, definitely what you've said about the first stage, about the freedom and about the possibility of completely different approaches, that's valid for my subjects, because as a teacher of history, I see myself, I see that I have a big freedom, how to do it, when to do it. I can start with Second World War and nobody cares. Like, but the point is, when I don't have the experience and I don't have the good resources, like maybe textbooks, because we don't have good textbooks mainly, that's a threat. Because there are maybe a lot of teachers who can't handle this freedom. And it was interesting for me to hear about the jump from the first to second stage, because as I see it from my perspective, maybe it's because of my school, and because of my particular experience, sometimes they're much drilled in the first stage than in the second.
Okay.
Whatever. And it's interesting that you've mentioned in the interview before the competence-based curriculum. I know that the UK is going out of it, if it's true. And you said something like that our curriculum, it's quite unique a bit in terms of international curriculum, because the one who looks like ours doesn't function much all around the globe. So if you can say something about this. And still you can ask questions, Lucy, via Zoom or here in chat, please.
So I think the different parts of, from what I've seen, the different parts of the tech curriculum function quite differently. The first phase, where it's quite high level, quite not very specific. There are lots of systems that are taking that approach, and they're competency based, and they just give them very high level understandings about not very specific at all about what students need to understand, and that has been quite problematic in some countries from an equity perspective. So places like New Zealand, Scotland, and the knowledge is kind of lost a bit. The role of knowledge is downplayed so much that children aren't really, it sounds bizarre, but it's not a focus. There's too much of a focus on competencies and not enough of a focus on knowledge. And the reason that's a problem, because you might think, oh, well, you know, does it matter if they're not doing knowledge, if they have competencies? The trouble is you can't have the competencies without the knowledge, because competencies are using a child's ability to use knowledge. So they don't have the knowledge to use, then they can't have the competencies. And so you need, still in a curriculum, you need to be explicit about what knowledge are we teaching and when, so that children can build up their knowledge in lots of different areas, so that then they can use it to be creative in that area or solve problems in that area. Competencies are not things which can float around the different subjects without any knowledge underpinning them.
Sure. We got a question here in chat from Angelika Gergelova. Differentiation was mentioned among student-oriented approach methods. You were also talking about high expectations regarding all students' performance as one of the principles of the most successful educational systems. Can we assume that different tasks for different students is not something that would help the students perform better?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because differentiation is understood differently in different places. And it can be great, it can be awful. So if the different work for different students, different tasks for different students, to some degree that can be a good thing. So when it comes to, for example, giving students who've already understood the content a different task to further their understanding to that is harder, or they're going into something more deeply, then that's a good and helpful thing. The problem comes, and I think the association in the student-oriented section there, the problem comes when different tasks to different students means we're going to give these students really easy work because they can't cope with the curriculum. Then it becomes a problem, because rather than thinking, how can we support these students to access the same curriculum as everyone else so that they can then continue to make progress and understand what's coming next year, instead, it's a case of, oh, well, I'm going to give these guys a different worksheet. They can do something that's easier, and then they never catch up. They fall further and further behind because they're always given easier work instead of being supported to do the same standard as everyone else. So, so that's when differentiation becomes problematic. So it's not that different tasks are, is never a good thing. It can be good if it's done sensitively and with the goal in mind always of we're supporting students to reach the same standards. And it might be that you give students additional support, and actually that does look like, sometimes that does look like different work, because you've given them a bit of, if you've got a student who just doesn't speak Czech as a first language, then you might give them a sheet with the vocabulary with their language on it. That's entirely appropriate, because that's additional support to help them to reach the same standard as everyone else. But what you're not doing is giving them something which means that they're never going to keep up.
You mentioned students with different mother language. That's quite a topic for us this year, like maybe for all Europe, because of the Russian aggression. And in the UK, you have much more experience than us with dealing with. So what would be some advice for teacher in the class? You mentioned that one, you give the same task, but you support them in another way. But what other?
So different systems take different approaches to this. So in Finland, for example, when students arrive new to the country and they don't speak Finnish, they have a year where they're in school, so the same school as everyone else, but a different class, where they're learning intensive Finnish with lots and lots of support. And then after 1 year, they then go into classes with everyone else, with then the teacher giving them extra support. In Canada, they go straight into the mainstream. But so I was interviewing someone recently who's an expert in teaching, in this instance, English as an additional language. And he was making the point that if as a teacher, if you teach in a way that makes the language more accessible, clarify what the words mean, have words on the wall, all of these things, they're helpful for every student. They're not only helpful for the students who have Czech as a second language, they're helpful for all of the Czech students too, because often in teaching, we're using academic vocabulary that probably is new to everyone. So actually to slow things down, to break things down, to put up signs that support language learning is good practice for all teachers to think about for all students, even if you don't have someone in the class who doesn't speak Czech.
Funny moment happened to me because the Ukrainian pupils have like I would say more academic biology than our kids, and I realized in one moment in class that the Ukrainian pupils are much more in than the Czech.
Oh, wow.
Because they know it better. Because maybe it's because they do the team at in Ukraine, and they were those who were helping to explain.
Oh, wow.
And it was really interesting to switch the situation.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
And thank you for saying that all students can benefit for it, because sometimes in Czech media and the talks, they are like, when we help the slower, we will also slow the fast, and it won't be good and stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's quite sad,
yeah.
but it's important to hear that this is not how it works.
And actually, if you look at research on how teachers teach students when you do have separate classes, if you have a class in one school that's for the higher ability kids and a class in one school that's the lower ability kids, there are lots of different research suggests that teachers tend to go too fast for the higher achieving kids because they assume, oh, these are the smart kids, I just talk fast, and actually a lot of them are, they hear it but they don't understand it. And then teachers go too slow for the lower achieving kids because the teacher thinks, oh, these kids aren't very smart, I need to go very slowly. And actually that's why, one of the reasons why all children tend to perform better in a mixed class, because rather than just making assumptions about what the kids understand, the teacher has to check and also has to have a different plan for those students who at any point, rather than saying, right, you five are going to sit over there, you're my smart kids, and you five are going to sit over there, you're my not smart kids. In any lesson, which children understand this concept quicker can be different. So actually, each lesson in Japan, for example, when they plan, there's a principle of you plan for 2 groups of kids in every lesson. The kids who at any point in the lesson understand it, and the kids who don't understand it. So what are you doing for the kids who understand it, and what are you doing for the kids who don't yet understand? And then you would just have to plan for 2 groups.
Good point of view. I'm for myself, I'm thinking about like I think for myself I can catch the slower to put them up, but I'm not good with the ones who are up, who are faster, but still they are that middle layer. During COVID, it happened that these kids just went off, and it was important for me as a teacher to see it because these kids may were off like during the normal lessons, but we didn't see them. There's another question, and thank you for that, from Michal Hudeček. You wrote a book in 2016. Do you see any changes in education system around the world being made since then that would be aligned with the conclusions from your book? Any good examples of countries that managed to transition well?
Oh, I mean, I like the premise of the question. I'm flattered by the premise of the question. I don't think that any countries have changed their education system based on what I have said in my book. I don't know if that was implied. Any changes made online with conclusions from the book?
Or maybe not totally.
I mean, England, to be fair, has changed what they're doing. Systems. England, not the UK.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. But that's what I mean. So Wales and Scotland is something different, but England has. So England is now, they've really, I don't think it was because of anything I said, but they've really taken on board the teacher professionalization. Like, how can we make teaching more of a profession, more respected as a profession? And it's not just a cultural thing. And those of you who've read my book will remember that I refer to a profession. Actually, it's not just the case. In fact, it's not the case of saying do whatever you like, because that's not what we do with doctors or lawyers or any other profession. We would be shocked, wouldn't we, if we had a doctor and they're like, oh yeah, you haven't got to follow the guidelines, you just do what you think is best. And we expect doctors and lawyers to have a shared body of knowledge based on evidence that they use. The autonomy comes from how they use all of that evidence to do this particular patent or this particular claim. I think it should be the same with teachers. So we need to have a shared body of knowledge about, the best evidence on child development and the best pedagogical content knowledge, which is where the pedagogy and your subject overlap. So not just what's the best way to teach or what is the mathematics, but what is the best way to teach this particular element of mathematics that leads to children understanding it. So I think teachers need a shared body of knowledge, and then they need to then, having got that, be given the freedom to then use that to the best of their ability for the particular kids in front of them. So what they've done in England is they've introduced a new program for new teachers. So for the first 2 years of teachers' career now in England, they have to follow what's called an early career framework, which is continued learning beyond the initial teacher education, and everyone's is more or less the same for the whole country. So they're building this shared body of knowledge, which is very important, not just because everyone's going to know some important things, but it also means that all the teachers have the same language. So they have a shared reference point. They can all actually talk about their practice with this language, in the way that if you don't have that and you just have initial teacher education and every university taught something a bit different and used different words, it's actually quite difficult even to have a professional conversation, because when I say student oriented, that means something totally different to what you think when you think student oriented. So England.
Okay,
yeah,
that's quite interesting. My question would be, in England, you work like this with the newcomers. But what about the others? Because in Czech Republic, in the regional system, I don't know the English meaning, we have around 160,000 teachers, and each year from all the faculties of education and stuff, I think it could be something around 10,000.
Yeah,
maybe. So what about the others?
Yeah, so England hasn't addressed that yet. I mean, I think one way, so this isn't since my book, this was, I don't think, I think this is before, not that it would have come from my book anyway, but in some states in America, they had an approach of introducing essentially a teacher career structure, similar to the one they have in Singapore, but in America they did it a little bit differently because massive cultural differences. So rather than suddenly changing everyone's contracts, which would have been politically a disaster, they introduced new roles on the side. So you could be a master teacher or you could be a senior teacher, and that came with more money and a new responsibility to support your colleagues to improve. So that actually worked quite well, because those teachers, established teachers, experienced teachers, in order to do those roles, they had to demonstrate that they could do certain things already and then do more learning themselves. And then their responsibility was to support the learning of other teachers within the system too. So that was one way of changing it.
We tried to do this in 2016, and we politically failed. And it was my first experience like with educational politics and policy, and it was quite interesting because it wasn't perfect.
Okay. What happened?
That's quite a good question. And from my point of view, like the starting teacher and the student of Faculty of Education, there was a massive counterattack or something like that, and from the political positions, and it went off the table. And from the time we weren't able to try something like this, like on Friday, actually, there was a novel or one paper, I think paper, which gives us for the newcomers, you have how to translate, the peer teacher for you, like the mentor and stuff, and it's connected with money.
Right.
Like, let's hope it will be there. Thank you for that. Also, when we are talking about PISA tests, my question is, if for me as a common teacher, are PISA tests valid? Like, what can I learn from them? How can I work with them? Why should I care? Like in my class here somewhere. So
it can be quite just useful as an assessment tool, because these questions have been developed very, very carefully. There's some quite good assessment items. They've developed PISA for schools, which is specifically for schools to use. I mean, I don't think that you should that should be driving the teaching. I think it might just be an interesting thing to do to try kids and see, how is it different to the assessment that you're doing in your class on a regular basis. Might not be so relevant in your history teaching, but for biology, for example, it might be interesting just to see, is it the same kids who do well on the PISA tests and your traditional tests? Is there anything that you could learn about how you do assessment from the way that the PISA organizes assessment in terms of the application of knowledge.
Okay. Okay, that's quite an interesting theme. That our discussion is slowly ending. Okay, it can. My last question in that case is that now, last year, this year, and next year, we are having a curricular reform. And what would be a good advice from your perspective, how to do this reform good? And I don't mean how we because we as teachers and maybe the parts of the middle tier and stuff, not only the Ministry of Education, because we can't reach them, but what everyone from us can do to do it better.
That's the very interestingly framed question. So not what the government can do, but what the kind of educational society almost. Yes. So that's exactly what I have been working on in Wales and Scotland, because the system in the curriculum, the national curriculum in Wales and Scotland is too vague, I think. Based on, having had a look at a lot of curricula around the world, it's very vague and leaves space for a lack of coherence, a lack of equity. I have been working with education society, the middle tier, groups of schools, and getting groups of schools to come together to take the national framework and basically interpret it and make it more specific and more understandable for teachers and for students in terms of the organization of that knowledge. So it's not just about what knowledge is in there, it's also about how is it presented, so that students can see the connections between their learning in phase 1, for example, and the learning in phase 2. And teachers can see the connections, so that you as a teacher are able to look back and say, okay, well, I'm just about to teach this. What is it that children have learned before that can help support this new learning? And then you can explicitly link that in. So it's partly about reorganizing the national framework. So I think, I'd be happy to work with you or work with anyone here if you'd like to hear more about how we've done that in Wales and Scotland. But I think it's about getting together with staff in your school, ideally from a shared workload perspective, with teachers from other schools as well, all of the schools in a municipality or in a wider area, to sit down and say, right, history, let's look at history. What's in the curriculum? What are the gaps that we need to fill in? What are we going to understand by this? Because this is very vague. Or, those kinds of questions, and to develop something for your whole area, or at least your school, so that you can see how children make progress, or how you want children to make progress within particular areas over the whole curriculum from age 6 or 7 to age 15.
Okay. Thank you for that, and let's work on that
together.
Thank you for having you here. With some thanks from Zoom, and thank you for your questions and for your attendance on Úspěch pro každého žáka conference.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.